Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Geno Munari. His last name is spelled Munari. He just published January 12th, 2022. Very interesting book, very well researched about the subject I'm interested in, which is Vegas and early Vegas. Title of his book is Las Vegas's Dunes Hotel, Casino, and Country Club: The Mob, the Connections, the Stories. And Mr. Munari has written other books. There's a lot of books written by him about magic, card tricks. I'm not going to list them all, but you can see them on Amazon. So he's definitely been writing. He moved to Geno Munari moved to Las Vegas in 1964 and was involved in all facets of the gambling and hospitality business. He was an adjunct professor at UNLV from 1980 to 1985. He was also a weekly columnist for the Herald Examiner's West Coast supplement, Vegas Magazine. And his website is his full name. So it's www.genomunari.com. And you can look and learn about the book there. But again, it just was recently published. So Geno Munari, thanks for coming on the show and agreeing to the interview.
Thank you, William, for inviting me on. It's a pleasure indeed.
Awesome. Well, congratulations. Awesome. Well, congratulations on the book. I know you have a long history in Vegas. Maybe you can just kind of talk about a little bit of your career background and then what led you to put together this book, Las Vegas's Dunes Hotel.
Well, I graduated high school out of Burbank, California, and that was in June of 1964. And that week, I moved to Las Vegas with about $40 in my pocket. And I had a grandmother that was up here, and I stayed with her, and I went to UNLV, and I got a job at the Sahara Hotel, which I have a cousin who was one of the original founders of that hotel. Came down here from Montana with Milton Prell, and they built the Sahara Hotel, which was like in the 50s, 52 or so. And I got a job as a busboy. I started at the bottom. And then 6 months later, they moved me into the dealer's room, which was a room where all the dealers had their 20-minute break. They'd work 40 or an hour on, or 45 and 15 off, and they'd go to this little room and have coffee. This was all during their shift. So I got to know all the dealers, and I listened to all the stories, and I was fascinated by gambling, and I basically learned how to deal listening to these guys. And then when I turned 21, I went downtown to Frank Schivo, who was my cousin. He built a place. They had a place they bought called California Club, which was the old California Club, not to be confused with Sam Boyd's California Hotel. And they had the Pioneer Club, and they had the Elwell Hotel. And I got a job there as a slot department, kind of a host and floor man, you might say. And then I worked there 6 months, 9 months, and then I went into the games department where I learned some of the 21 games, and I learned 21 and roulette and a little bit of craps. And then when I stayed there a few years, and then I said, it's time to go out to the Strip maybe and get a job. So I went out to the Flamingo and did they call it an audition. That's what you call yourself when you go out and ask for a job. They put you on the table, you see if you can deal, and you can deal. They may put you to work. They may put you on a list if there's no openings and call you back. So I got done with my audition at the Flamingo, and the guy said, "You're not ready yet." And so I felt I was. I spent my time downtown, but that was a real prestigious job, and they didn't have any openings. So I said, "Oh, thanks," and I went outside and I looked across the street, almost catty corner was the Dunes Hotel. I said, "I'm going to go over there and see if I can audition there." I did that, and they hired me right on the spot. So that was the start of it. And then worked in the 21 pit for 6-7 months, and I'm at home. We had a layout from a baccarat table, and me and a friend of mine started learning baccarat together, and we practiced counting. That was dealt with real money, by the way, currency. The only game in Las Vegas that was dealt that way. We didn't use casino chips, other than if somebody was betting, like $4,000 a hand. So I'm learning the game at home, and I really don't know it. And we used to watch the bosses at the Dunes, and see what kind of mood they were in. If they were in a good mood, you could approach them and ask them a favor, request something. So I said this one day, this guy, Mr. Duckworth, George Duckworth looked like he was in a decent mood. So I caught him as he was walking out of the pit. And I said, Mr. Duckworth, I'm learning Baccarat at home, and I'd love to go over and practice on my own time for nothing. Don't want any money, just to learn. He says, get yourself 2 tuxedos and start tomorrow. I said, wait a minute. He walked away from me. I didn't even know the game. So I got 2 tuxedos, and I started Thursday night, and that was the start of a pretty long run in Baccarat to dudes. And a very unique job. It was like the best job you could get. I was only 22 years old, and so it was quite an experience.
And how long did you deal baccarat for?
I dealt, I think, about 6 years. Then I was on the floor for 2 years. So those guys just didn't leave those jobs. Something had to happen. And the floor men were in where the casino tips, or the tokes, we called them. And so one day when I'm dealing, I get off the side where you call the hand. That's called the stick. That's where the dealer calls the hand, like players 3, banker 5, stand, so forth and so on. And I came around the corner to go to the other side, called the base side. One of the floor men, who was very nice to me, he said, "Can you come here a second?" He said, "Would you?" He didn't do it very loud. He did it kind of quietly. He said, I had something wrong with my eye. I had a little problem today. I can't quite make that out. Can you please read that for me?" And I read this thing, and I was thinking, I explained it to him, and I said, I'm thinking in my head, I think it was easy to read. I think maybe he had trouble with some of the bigger words in English. He was from Brooklyn, and he was a guy that was basically a yous and these and that's guy. He was the nicest guy in the world, Vinny Tagliatella. And he kind of took a liking to me after that, like a personal, he took me under his wing, and he taught me everything there was to know. And this guy, I had no idea. He was a Shylock. That's a money lender who lends, for so much percent a week. The juice, they call it. And if you borrow $100, you pay 5%, $5 a week, and you still owe the $100. And he was also a big bettor, a bookie. I had no idea, about all of it, but little by little, him and his wife were so nice. They invite me to their house to have a meal on Sunday. It was like living with my parents. My dad had died, and he was almost like another dad to me. He was just a nice guy. And from there on, I was around the dunes, and I witnessed a lot of stuff. So I thought it would be fitting to maybe memorialize this, because I really believe that the dunes owners that I work for, I think they would have liked it. I think they would have been proud of it, as long as it was told correctly, without any, any literary license, which there's none in my book whatsoever. I wouldn't write anything unless I could have a backup source. There's a couple places where I have to come to a conclusion, and I say that it could have been this, or it could have been that, but or it could have been this, and some of that is strictly speculation on my part. But there's not too much of that. I try to be as accurate as I possibly can. And
Right,
so,
and you mentioned Duckworth in your book, so you met some of these owners that dunes changed hands in ownership much more than I thought. After reading your book, I was surprised.
yeah, there was quite a few major corporations.
Maybe you can go back to, like, you talk about a lot of history. I mean, you really to go back to where gambling started in the U.S. and the movement to Vegas and all of these characters. Maybe you can just go back, talk about vintage Las Vegas, the barn, how it all started.
Well, the barn you're talking about was not Las Vegas. That was in New Jersey.
Right.
And that was a guy who was one of the baccarat managers at Caesar's Palace when they opened in 1966. Was a guy by the name of Larry Snow. And Larry Snow's real name was Snofsky, Snofsky. And he was the baccarat manager at Caesar's. Now, Caesar's, was pretty mobbed up, as well as the dunes was. And from FBI reports that I've read, and I have, they surmised that a gangster from New York, his name is Fat Tony Salerno, was one of the biggest stockholders in Caesar's Palace. And Fat Tony Salerno, was an associate of Larry Snow, as was Joe Adonis and a few other guys. And so it's really funny. Uh, when I did a search and a background on Larry Snow, he was in Cuba, he worked in Havana, he represented a couple of guys. But one interesting thing is that he was a limo driver. I had a garage in in New Jersey, and it was just on the other side of the Washington Bridge, out of Manhattan in New York. And they would take their limos and fill them up full of people and pick them up at certain locations and bring them over to the Washington Bridge and take them to a place called the Barn and a couple of other places that were operated by Moretti, Adonis, and a lot of other big name guys. And so it's really funny. In the late 30s, I believe it was, or when Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped, you know, one of the big mobsters in New Jersey, gave $30,000 to Lindbergh family, to show a good faith, because they could do anything they wanted there in New Jersey. The cops looked the other way. They gambled. The only thing they didn't do was prostitution and drugs, because they have a local community and they wouldn't stand for that. The gambling, they figured it didn't bother anybody. So he gave a big reward to the finder of whoever killed that baby. Incidentally, Larry Snow, who was the Baccarat manager at Caesars, went to the FBI and told them the guy that represented the killer came into his garage to have a repair done. He had a bent fender and he did a paint job on it. So I found that in the New York Times. I thought that was an amazing story. So Caesars, was a big joint, and it was filled up with various guys from the East. Well, the Dunes, kind of like was there before Caesars was built, and so they had a lot of the same players, a lot of the same gamblers, and so on. But kind of lost track here. I got off.
Well, you were talking kind of about the early part of the Dunes, because a lot of the original investors were involved in other gambling operations throughout the country, right? Al Gottsman was connected to Lansky. You said he had 50 gambling operations around the country. So they were getting money before they decided to go to Vegas, right?
Yeah, Lansky had a lot of operations around the country, but he wasn't directly involved in the Dunes as so much as an incident that happened. But all those guys were connected. They were connected in one way or another. And the Dunes basically didn't really get rolling. Gottsman just couldn't make it, so he sold it to the Sands. So the Sands, that was Lansky and all those other guys in New York. And the Sands couldn't make any money with it, so they decided to get rid of it. And in came in a couple of other partners that were original Dunes guys, was Major Riddle. And he brought in a guy by the name of Bill Miller, who had the Miller's place just over the bridge in New Jersey. He had gambling there as well himself, but some of the people that he was associated with. So he came in and they turned the Dunes around, and they started bringing in up and back junkets from LA and Phoenix, overnight trips on an airplane. You bring $200, you stay all night, and you leave the following morning. And that was kind of like the thing that turned the Dunes around. They had good entertainment. They had the Minsky Follies in there. And then the Major Riddle came in and purchased stock from Gottlieb, who owned the building. And he didn't own the business. He owned the building and the land. So they let the M&R Riddle and Miller and Riddle come in there, M&R Investment Company. And they came in there and they operated. And then, there were some issues with Major Riddle. I found a memo from the FBI that the internal bosses at the Dunes Hotel caught him stealing in the neighborhoods of $40,000 to $50,000 a month. So they basically I think they had a big talk with him, and that's when Sid Wyman, George Duckworth, Charlie Rich, et al., and some others came in there and started operating the place in 1961. And from there, they never looked back until it was basically exploded, uh, imploded rather. Excuse me. It wasn't
Right.
imploded, but it was also they had bombs and they made a movie with the thing. But it was a great success. But really made the Dunes though. They had everything of the finest you could offer. The finest steakhouse, Sultan's Table, with magical violins. It was absolutely wonderful. The best food you possibly could have. They had uh, Dome of the Sea, which was a little seafood restaurant where a little girl rode like a little kind of a floating boat with a harp, and she played music with a harp. It was wonderful. Kippy Lou, her name was. They had the top of the strip where you could look at the beautiful view. They had two lounges. They had a and a major showroom. It was Casino de Paris. Wonderful French Revue with 100 actors and actresses. It was unbelievable, and they had everything. It was a city within a city, and what
It
really made
seems
it
like
work.
they, sorry to interrupt, but it seems like they had learned from the mistakes of the past about marketing and getting people in there and getting the right acts, right? That Al
It,
Gottesman may have not have been as skilled about.
you know, Gottsman wasn't a gambler. He was an operator who thought big, and he spent more money on a show that had this actress uh, Vera Miles. No, not Vera Miles. I'm thinking of. Oh, hold on a second. I got so many people
Uh,
in the show. But anyway,
right now,
Vera Ellen, and she was like
right.
unbelievable. But the show was just overrun in cost, and it was expensive, and it just wasn't the right thing. And so Bill Miller, who had the Riviera in New Jersey over the Washington Bridge, he was an entertainment genius. He's the guy that brought the Beatles to Las Vegas.
Wow.
He's the one that brought Barbara Streisand to the International. And he was a genius. Uh, and so they turned it around, but then they had some conflicts, and Bill Miller decided to leave, and he went his other way. And he worked for the Sahara and International later on. Genius guy. His daughter, Judith Miller, is one of the top was a top reporter on NBC for a long time,
Oh wow, that was his
and
daughter.
a great book writer. She was the one that wouldn't reveal a source, and she went to jail rather than reveal a source in her book. So these guys were smart. But what turned the Dunes around? What really was the move was when they brought junkets from New York City. They took the people out of New York, best gamblers they could find, and they had guys that knew who to find the best gamblers. Bookmakers and money people, restaurateurs. They knew who they were, and they brought them to the Dunes. 3 days, 2 nights, all you can eat, all you can drink. Just gamble a little bit, put $5,000 up in front line or more, and maybe even less sometimes. And he'd fill the plane up with 250 passengers. They'd be there. Time Sunday afternoon comes, they lost all their money. Now, this happened every 2 weeks. That was the real move that made the Dunes an outstanding hotel.
And it really was kind of a status icon in the 60s and 70s, right? Really in the vintage time of Las Vegas. Is that correct?
It was a major place. It was class. It wasn't like you know, it wasn't it was just shining. It was just, in fact, Howard Hughes, when he moved out to the Desert Inn, before he moved to the Desert Inn, he sent his particular frontman, Mayu, out to rent rooms at the Dunes. So he rented 2 floors on top of the Dunes, and they put all the phones in that he needed and everything, and he never moved in. They were empty, but they were being paid for. QP Rich
Interesting.
was Charlie Rich. That was Sid Wyman's partner, George Duckworth's stepfather. He said, "We can't do this. We need him for our players." So they asked him to leave, and then he left and he went to the Desert Inn. That was an interesting thing. And the Dunes only had 1,000 rooms, and all those penthouse rooms and those tower suites were really nice. And so, somebody on the New York junket, they want the best, and the gamblers deserve the best, and that's what they did. Uh,
Right. And
the
there,
owners in '61, Duckworth, Wyman, Sid Wyman, George Duckworth, Charles QP Rich, they're from St. Louis, and they were big time gamblers back then, big bookmakers. I mean, they knew their stuff. And St. Louis, uh, Charlie Rich had a little boxing gym, and that's how he met Cary Grant. And they became lifelong friends. Cary Grant used to come to the dunes all the time, and he was always friendly with everyone. And he was a he was kind of a spokesman for the dunes to help find entertainment and so forth. But when they moved to Las Vegas, they knew what they were doing. They were big time, and they knew gamblers from all over the world because they used the Western Union wire service to get bets to bring them to their booking house, and they paid the writers a commission and gave them gifts. It was like unbelievable. Nobody ever thought of that before.
Right. So they were forward thinking, and there was always an undercurrent of mob connections, right? Even from the very beginning.
Yeah,
And,
there was.
and
There was. From St. Louis, you had a lot of guys, and a couple of the guys that came to work at the dunes were all connected. You know, with a couple of guys back there, uh, Savella, uh, uh, Giordano, uh, and they were kind of the local mob guys in St. Louis. And I'm sure that they had to get to know each other either through gambling, wagering, bookmaking, and laying off, and so forth. And who knows if they put a street tax on them? But I know Savella, uh, who was from Kansas City, and he was a guy that went to jail, over the Tropicana and the Stardust hotels of skimming. He approached the owners of the dunes when they were at the Riviera. So Wyman, Duckworth, and Rich were at the Riviera in the 50s. And we have a confidential memo from the FBI that uh, they found out that Savella wanted to buy into the Riviera. And Wyman turned him down, and a couple of owners turned him down, and Wyman left the Riviera. They came and they ran the Dunes Hotel. So they were all connected. But then in the late 70s, like 75, 76, Savella showed up at the Dunes Hotel as a guest, and on his room check-in, there was a note that said, "Give the man anything he wants." And of course, the Dunes got called on the carpet for this. And what's interesting, they got fined $50,000 for having this guy from Kansas City Mafia guy, come and stay at the Dunes. So he was a persona non grata. But so the Dunes had to go to the Gaming Control Board hearing and fight this charge of a $50,000 fine, and also that the major owner Sid Wyman come forward for suitability hearings and get another license. So their lawyers, who were great lawyers, Jones and Jones, and the one Jones was one of the original lawyers for the original conception of the Dunes under Gottsman, who was the original builder of the Dunes. Uh, they got the fine reduced to $10,000, and Sid Wyman didn't have to come before the board for a suitability hearing. Now, what kind of juice is that? That's incredible. I mean, this is incredible days. So it was
right.
a great, great place, and they gave donations to everyone. Anyone that asked, they got something from them. So they were well liked in the community. Uh, there was no bad feeling about these guys. If you felt good about them, and they ran a great operation.
And it sounds like that, like Rich, who was friends with Cary Grant. The people said he was very generous, giving money around. But he also had to show up in front of the Kefauver Commission, right? So there
Yeah, that
always
was
was.
that was an interesting meeting when they had Rich on the stand, and Rich, they wanted to know why he was out in Las Vegas with all this money looking to buy into something, and they questioned him about Lansky, uh, Meyer Lansky, the tremendous. He was called the kind of like the mob's accountant. That's a typical term you hear. But he was a genius when it came to gaming. He knew about gambling. He knew how to set it up. He knew how to make it work. Uh, uh, this is an interesting story because before the Dunes, before the Wyman, anyway, back to the Flamingo hearing, and Rich is on the stand. He's looking to buy into something, and they really put him over the coals, and they wanted to know who he knew here, and did he buy in? Well, he didn't buy into the Flamingo, but he heard about it through Lansky. There's no doubt about it. So then before the Dunes opened, I mean, before they took over the Dunes in '61, they had a deal for the Thunderbird Hotel, which supposedly was really controlled by Meyer Lansky. And it was in the newspapers. I got plenty of references to it. And they were going to open and take it over under a new company and run it. And it was all getting ready to close. And all of a sudden, they didn't do that. And they went to the Dunes. They got that the partnership, went to the Dunes. Well, this is really a funny story because after QP Rich died and Sid Wyman died, George Duckworth's stepson, had to go through some papers in their estate. They found a document that showed that Wyman made a deal with Lansky in some way to not buy the Dunes. And at the time it happened, when they didn't go to the Thunderbird, Rich and Duckworth were not aware of it. So it was a secret deal Wyman made. And all the details I don't have completely, but I was told this firsthand by Duckworth. So it was kind of an interesting situation. There was a little animosity, but they didn't really know what was going on. And Wyman was a terrific gambler. I mean, he gambled all the time. So it might have been a question of a finder's fee he got, which they say that there was, and maybe it took him out of a big jam. He was in gambling all of his money away. He gambled all the time. So.
And Hoffa was around too. There's Teamsters involved in the story, Jimmy Hoffa and his contacts, right?
Yeah, Hoffa was a regular guest at the Dunes. I saw him in there myself with his wife. He was standing next to his wife in the slot machine. Everybody liked it. Everybody liked it. And he came to check in one time. No one knew he was there. And so the secretary to Major Riddle, Hoffa called Major Riddle's office. And Major Riddle's secretary picked the phone up. She said, "Hey, this is Jimmy Hoffa. You have a key for me?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Hoffa." And she brought it right down. Well, she got chewed out by Riddle. Riddle didn't want anyone to see that he was there. He was, like a secret guest under an assumed name. But Hoffa was the guy that put the money to build a high-rise, to let the Dunes expand. Hoffa was the guy that let Caesar's Palace open. And he was quite an individual. However, there was a dark side of him, and there was a lot of connections between the Teamsters and organized crime. And when Hoffa, went to jail for basically doing a deal with a kickback in Tennessee, he had to go to jail. He had to go to court there. After being convicted, he went to jail, and then he lobbied Nixon and family to get him out, and he finally got out. But Hoffa was barred from being reelected as a Teamster president for a certain time, and he didn't know that. And he was going around, telling everyone that the Teamsters, were not the way it was when he ran it, and the mob didn't like it, and that's surely the reason that Hoffa probably got killed and never found again. Incidentally, I believe that Dan Moldea, a famous, very noted writer, has got it right. He believes he knows where Hoffa was buried, and you can find that on the internet. Look at the Hoffa Moldea. You'll find a great story. I think FBI is going to discover where he actually was buried.
Yeah, I actually think I read a recent story. Like they say now he's under a bridge, so I don't know. He could be anywhere, but he controlled all the Teamsters retirement funds, right? So he could put that money, which was a huge amount of money, wherever he wanted. It's an immense amount of control. I think he spent a lot of it in Vegas, in different places. So
he did. I think the value of the Teamsters fund then was $4 billion. In today's money, that's like about what, 15 or 18 billion dollars. So
yeah,
it was a lot of money. And a lot of I skipped something here, but let me go back just a second.
Okay.
Jake Gottlieb, not to be confused with Gottsman. Jake Gottlieb was the one that bought the Dunes out of bankruptcy. Okay, when it went bankrupt the first bunch of guys, Gottsman. Gottlieb was from Chicago. There's no question there's some connections for him in the Chicago outfit. That's also the mob. They call it the outfit, though. And he had a brother by the name of Colonel John Gottlieb, who was the adjutant general to Eisenhower during World War II, who lived in Beverly Hills. I got to know him. And he was a guy that would go out in the Los Angeles area and some other areas using Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters funds to buy properties, to buy a motel or to buy a business. And the reason was, of course, to make some money, but to whatever employees belonged to that business, to get them enrolled as Teamsters. He was a big promoter. And I found an article in the Los Angeles Times where Hoffa says, Colonel Gottlieb and Jay Gottlieb were my first customers. And they were the ones where the Dunes got their big loan and went forward and forward. In the mid-70s, the major owners of the Dunes Hotel got indicted for skimming. That's taking money off the tables that's never reported. And the FBI trained some agents, a two-man team, to sit on each side of a crap table with a clicker in their hand to count how much money was dropped into the drop box. And the drop box is where you take currency and exchange it for chips. You give the chips to the player, you drop the currency in the drop box. So they clocked it back and forth. So they got indicted, and they finally went to court. And the Dunes used a very famous local attorney by the name of Harry Claiborne, who was a judge, a federal judge, who was impeached and got convicted. But he was a great trial attorney. And Morris Schenker, who was their attorney from St. Louis, who eventually bought the Dunes. So these guys that were indicted were major officers in the company. We're talking about, quite a bit of money. And so they didn't fire them. They just basically said, okay, we're going to take our shares and we're going to sell our shares to the Riviera owner. And they did that. Of course, that never went through. And so they got the shares back. They beat the case and they went right back to work. That's what's really interesting about this. The way they beat the case is that they challenged the knowledge of gambling to these agents. Like the defense attorney said, okay, Mr. Agent, tell me what a two-way 11 is on a crap table. Well, the agent wouldn't even know what that means. Two-way 11 means one for the player and one for the dealers. That's what it meant. Or give me a 7, give me a 6 on a hop. They asked that question. They couldn't answer it. A 6 on a hop would mean any way you can make a 6. It could be, they might specify it, like, give me a 4-2 on the hop. They would pay like, I think it's 30 to 1. 15 to 1, excuse me, on the hop. And they would pay that on a crap table. But they couldn't answer the question. So when it came down to an abundance of proof, they never really had the proof. They couldn't prove that they stole this money or skimmed it. And they got, they were freed. They were cleared of all the charges. But here's the most interesting thing of all. This court case happened in Reno, Nevada, in the Bruce Thompson courtroom, a federal judge. When I did my research for my book, I wanted to see a transcript of this trial. I gave them all the names of individuals and the company, M&R Investment Corporation, and none of it was found. I hired an attorney to do a search. It couldn't be located. It's like it never happened. There's no written transcripts. There's no records. There's nothing. That's a real mystery. To this day, I would love to know about that. Anybody out there knows about that or has a copy of those transcripts, I'll give you a reward if you can produce those for me. So that's, to me, incredible. I mean, I'm talking about a skimming case by the federal, prosecuted by the Justice Department. There's no record of it anywhere. That's a beauty for me. I don't understand that one.
That is incredible. Usually those court cases are some of the best recorded things ever. I mean,
Right.
they're somewhere in the system somewhere. You can find old court cases. They hold those boxes forever, or microfiche them or something. but to not find that is very, very
And
unusual.
I spent some money to do that. I mean, I just didn't do a cursory search on the internet. I hired someone to, whatever it takes to find it, let's find it. They could not find anything.
Wow,
That's a
that's
story.
incredible. It's just one of many stories associated with the dunes. I mean, and it really wasn't. I mean, now the property's in the midst of the strip, but when it first was built, it was kind of off to the side, right? It wasn't in the center of Vegas.
It was way out by the airport almost,
Yeah.
and there was nothing, up and down, north and south of it. It was in the middle of no place, but it worked when they brought business into the hotel. When they filled the rooms and built more rooms, it worked. And that's the secret of an operation. Good gambling, good food, good rooms. You keep them right there in the hotel. Don't let your hotel be a sleeping hotel and have all your customers go across the street to better food and better shows.
Good point. Yeah, that's the key. What was the connection between the dunes and the Kennedy assassination?
Well, this is a story I almost didn't want to write, but you know, I kind of like. I was in high school when Kennedy got assassinated, and I liked him. I thought he was a great guy. And today he would be considered a very conservative Republican, basically, the way he thought. He wasn't such a liberal as people as today are, but he was a very interesting guy. And I remember when I was working uh, at the California Club. A friend of our family's, his name was Dick Westbrook, who lived in Burbank, who was from St. Louis, and he got ran out of St. Louis. They called him by the Hots, by some mob guys, and he moved to Burbank because Burbank had a big baseball field built by the city that the St. Louis Browns would come and do their winter baseball practice right there. He built a motel right across the street, and he was a great guy. But I was a kid. I went to school with his son, and his son got in some trouble. We went to a little Catholic school, and he got into some trouble, not in school, but someplace else. And the city and the judge, they were done with him. They were going to say, either you move out of town, or you're going to go to jail. So his father went to my dad and said, listen, can he come up and live with you guys? I'll get them a way to make some money, and you'll make some money, and it'll be great. So we went to the Frontier Hotel, which was mob run by the Detroit guys. This was like 1968, 66, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly. And he got us a concession for his son and I to sell them soap, the cleaning soap to clean the kitchens and in the dishwashers and in the washing machines and all that stuff. And we made each of us, we made like $1,000 a month for selling soap to them. This guy, Westbrook, had a couple of friends, and one of them was one of the biggest, Johnny Stone, one of the biggest bookies in Dallas. And then there was a friend of theirs, his name was R.D. Matthews, who wore a patch over his eye, who I realized when I'm writing the book, that's interesting. How do I know all these guys from Texas? And then Johnny Stone, they knew Jack Ruby, like the back of your hand, right? And so then I'm writing my book, and I didn't think about putting anything about that in my book. But I'm writing my book one day, and I'm sitting in an outdoor cafe. I'm just having a drink, a little lemonade, and I'm writing. I got a little manuscript with me. And a friend of mine I hadn't seen in quite a while he was inside, and he walked out. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm working on my book." He says, "Oh, yeah?" He says, "Well, someday we'll have to sit down and let me tell you about a very interesting thing about the Kennedy assassination you might like to know about." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah." So I made an appointment to meet him, and he told me the story of how, he was a sniper in the army, and he got out of the army in the Marines. He got out of the Marines. He was under a guy by the name of Chesty Pulley, who was a interesting character. And my friend, I'm going to leave his name completely out of this conversation, but he basically said I got out of the Marines, and I went to work in Alabama, where I'm from, in a place called Phoenix City, and then I went to work in Hot Springs, and I learned to deal 21 craps on the wheel. That's the roulette wheel. And so in those days, in the early 50s, there was no dealing schools in Las Vegas. You had to be taught by a friend or an old time dealer. He had to teach you the game. They wouldn't just
Right.
teach you for $5. They had to know you. So you were a referral. If you went to work someplace, they'd say, "Who taught you how to deal?" They'd say, "So and so did." Well, you better not do anything wrong, because it's going to reflect on that guy. So he's back in Hot Springs, and the owner of the casino gets a phone call from Mo Dalitz, who was the major stockholder at the Desert Inn Hotel. Mo Dalitz came out of Detroit, a personal friend of Jimmy Hoffa from day one. Mo Dalitz had a laundry back there. Hoffa had Teamsters unions connected with his laundries. Uh, and Hoffa was from Detroit as well. So he says, Mo, you got it? Mo says, "You got anybody I can send out to me?" "Yeah, I got a guy you might like. He just got out of the Marines not too long ago. He learned to deal real good. He's a good reel waller. He's also an expert uh, you know, shooter." Mo says, "That's funny." So anyway, send him out. So this friend of mine goes out to Las Vegas. He checks into the casino cage. They say, "Here's your apron. Here's your name badge. You start on Monday," or whatever it is. You sign in at the 21 pit, and that's it. And so he goes to work, and he's there about 2 weeks. And Mo Dalitz doesn't inquire yet until he gives the guy a chance to get into the show and I get into the deal. And he asks about him. He said the guy's a pretty good dealer. So Mo Dalitz calls him up to his office. He says, "I'd like to meet you." And so he comes up. He says, "You're doing a good job, and I'm glad that I hired you. And they said that you were a good sharpshooter." He says, "One day let's go out to the desert here and shoot some tin cans and stuff." Oh, he says, "Sure, I'd love to do that." Now, when you say out to the desert, in those days, you walked outside, walked 1 block, that's the desert. There was
Right.
nothing there. There was
Right.
absolutely nothing. So they did that. And this friend of mine, Mr. X, he could shoot a dime at a pretty good distance. He was very good. And Dalitz was impressed. He said, "Oh, maybe sometime I could use you for something." Kind of laughed and let it go. Anyway, this friend of mine worked for the Desert Inn for a year or two, and then they promoted him to an executive, and then pretty soon he worked for Dalitz doing special projects, checking on things and taking care of things that, it takes a guy on the outside to do, run errands, many, many things that you could, for people you could trust. And this fella, you'll read in the book a little bit more about the errands he did. Uh, I think when Dalitz had some trouble with people trying to extort him, I think this gentleman took care of it successfully. So Dalitz trusted him. So he's out on an errand thing for Dalitz, and he's all done with it, and he's coming back to give him the information. And Dalitz's secretary says, "They're out in the country club." That's a 2-story building that overlooks the Desert Inn golf course. This is right on the strip. Beautiful golf course. And the clubhouse is all windows. You can see everywhere. So this friend of mine goes up to the doorway to the stairs, and he says, "Oh, there's a meeting going on. I have to tell him you're here." So they went up and got Dalitz. Dalitz says, "Oh, come on, let him up." And Dalitz brings him up, and he says, "I want you to meet some guys." And they open a meeting room, and there's some gentlemen sitting at a table. And my friend was startled. He saw President Johnson. He saw Nick Savella, uh, Sam Giancana, and I believe it was also Carlos Marcello and somebody else at this
Wow.
table. Now, there was no heat on these guys in those days, other than Marcello had a little heat on him because of being deported, but he was part of the owner of the Tropicana, in the old days. And
Right.
but so Lyndon Johnson,
Savella's just for people, just a sec to interrupt, but Savella's an important part of this book. So he features very much in the St. Louis mob. Sorry.
yeah. So anyway, Dalitz says, "Gentlemen, this is the fellow I wanted you to say hello to." And they said hello, and that was it. And he said, "Talk to you later." A day later, uh, Dalitz calls my friend up to his office, Mr. X, and he says, "You'd like to do a little job for us, maybe? How do you feel about shooting a politician?" And my friend answered, "Well, I don't kill, I don't kill women and politicians." Something like that. Something to kind of. I got it in the book right up. There's so many. There's over 400, 500 pages in the book. Got
Right.
to make sure I get it right.
Stories. Many
Yeah.
stories. Yeah.
So, excuse me if I make a little mistake. Don't hang me, everyone. But he says, I don't mess with politicians. It causes too much trouble. Unless it's in another country and it's against our country, I won't go up against a politician ever, ever. Now, we don't know if Savella or Dalitz was talking about killing Castro. It could have been Castro. Could have been. And it could have been anybody.
Right.
So, so I interviewed my friend 2 times, both on tape, and talked to him without tape maybe 2 or 3 times. And I said, "Are you sure Lyndon Johnson was there?" He says, "Absolutely." I said, "Did he say anything to you?" He says, "No." He just looked at me. I didn't believe him. So I went to the presidential library. I went to Lyndon Johnson's presidential library, and I found out that he visited the Desert Inn Hotel in 1963, and he stayed in room 345. And when I heard that, I was like, wow. And then when I did some research about Hoffa and how Hoffa actually bribed the guy that testified against him, who was a fellow Teamster, $1 million to change his testimony against Hoffa. And then before that, he even tried to get this Edward Parton, who was written up in Life magazine, who was given the most extensive lie detector test by the FBI and passed. He tried to get him to kill Robert F. Kennedy. Then I changed my whole opinion about Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, I really believe that the mob had a great deal of doing in killing Kennedy. And I go into some details there. You might find it interesting to you, but
just putting Johnson in the same room with Savella and Marcello is very
the guy swears.
telling.
The guy swears to it, and
really
he's still alive. And I'm sure someday I'm going to get a phone call from somebody to talk to me, but I'm not looking forward to that, to tell you the truth.
Well, Geno, this is a really fascinating book. You've got many stories. We could probably talk about the stories in this book for 4 hours, but we're at about 50 minutes. How do you want to wrap this up? Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed before we?
Well, I'd like to give I have a Facebook, the Dunes Hotel, Facebook page, Dunes Hotel. If anybody has any Dune stories, I'd love to have them put on there. If anybody has any corroborating evidence that they can give us, love to have it. Don't be afraid to speak up. I'll protect your names. Love to have you. I hope everyone reads the book. To me, it wasn't about making money on this book. It was about telling the story that had to be told. And I felt that I did my job. I think I did my job as best I could do with what I had to work with. And you can get a hold of me at Geno Munari. That's one word, GenoMunari.com, GenoMunari.com, and on the Dunes Facebook page. And
awesome.
And I hope this gets your listeners interested, William. I hope they respond to it. I hope that you get a lot more questions you have to ask me.
Well, there's a lot of information in this book. I mean, I feel like we kind of just went over the surface. Like, there's a lot of other details. There's many stories about St. Louis mob and all these other people, and just the connections are really something else, just like it's in your title. And again, the title of the book is Las Vegas's Dunes Hotel, Casino, and Country Club. The Mob, the Connections, the Stories, and the author is Geno Munari, just published January 12th, 2022. Thank you so much for your time, Geno.
William, thank you for having me on the show.
Awesome.